They are part of the circle of life. And, when we start removing things from that atrophic cascade, sometimes things don't go according to plan.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Jessica, Executive Director of Wild Cumberland.
And I'm Devin, a Wild Cumberland volunteer.
We appreciate you being here.
We start every single podcast episode with the same reminder. Our monthly email newsletter is the very best way to stay up to date on issues affecting Cumberland Island and its wilderness. So if you haven't already, go to wildcumberland.org and get yourself signed up.
We like to use these special podcast episodes to dig deeper into topics related to the seashore and, most importantly, its wilderness. So today, we are honored to do that with Dr. Chris Mowry.
Dr. Chris Mowry is an associate professor of biology at Berry College. He is the founder of the Atlanta Coyote Project and has been conducting research on coyotes for more than 2 decades. Chris served on the Science Advisory Council of the Yellowstone Ecological Research Center and was a lead investigator on a 20-year ecology project in Yellowstone National Park. What a mouthful. Chris earned his undergraduate degree in biology from Wake Forest University, and his master's and PhD are from Emory University. Chris, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Look forward to speaking with you.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to speak with you too. I've heard a lot about you through Jess, so we're excited to delve into this. Tell us a little bit about yourself. I know I gave you just a highlight outline of your career and everything. So, tell us about your upbringing and kind of how you got to where you are.
Yes. Well, thanks for your interest. So I am from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That's where I was born and raised. And then, as you said, I went to undergraduate at Wake Forest University and continued migrating south and ended up at Emory University. And I was really trained in graduate school as an animal ecologist. And really, the first half of my career was as a primatologist. So I went to Kenya. That was where I did my dissertation. I studied an endangered species of primate called the Tana River red colobus monkey. I was interested in what this animal was eating, the dietary choices that it was making, but it's also an endangered species. And so it really got me very early in my career introduced to a wide range of very valuable tools, ecological tools, conservation tools, dealing with people, dealing with governmental organizations. And so it was extremely valuable. It was a life-changing experience. And I really spent, as I say, a lot of time doing that. I then accepted a position at Berry College when I got finished at Emory University. And I've been there ever since, but I've been really fortunate to, go around the world studying primates in various countries like Madagascar and Eritrea and Kenya. But it was really a student who got me involved in the study of coyotes. And I will say, I always sort of tell this story when I speak to the public, is when I first got to Berry, my wife and I were living near Emory. And so I was spending 2 nights a week on campus, so I didn't have to make the drive all the time. So I was there at night and I was hearing these sounds and I thought, what the heck am I hearing? And I didn't really know what it was. I thought, are those coyotes? But, we don't have coyotes. I didn't understand what it was. And so, of course, it was coyotes. And so that was kind of my first introduction. But then, fast forward a few years and it was a student, as I say, who really got me interested. He'd done a summer internship in Yellowstone with wolves, got to know about coyotes, came back and said, hey, we should study coyotes. I said, okay. So we started off just with remote cameras, film cameras, mind you. And, just sort of trying to learn as much about these animals as we could. And so we did that for a few years. And then my good friend and colleague with the Atlanta Coyote Project, we didn't have the Atlanta Coyote Project at that time, but his name is Dr. Larry Wilson. Larry was a longtime ecologist at Fernbank Science Center. We were graduate students together at Emory, came out of the same lab. And Larry, he's very interested in what I was doing. He's a fantastic biologist. He said, you really should look at coyotes in urban environments. We have them in Fernbank Forest. And why don't you come and give a talk, And so I said, okay. And that was in 2012. Mm-hmm. So I gave this talk at Fernbank Science Center, and it was very well attended. And that really sort of showed us, what, we've got something here that people are really anxious to have more information about. It's a very misunderstood animal. It's a very controversial animal. I know. So we really saw an opportunity to educate the public, but really we are interested as biologists.
Right.
It's a very interesting animal, as I say, from a biological perspective. So we started the Atlanta Coyote Project officially in 2015, I think it was.
Nice. Congratulations on that. You're approaching 10 years almost of that. How does
Yeah,
that
which
feel?
is hard to believe. Yeah, no, it's great. I feel really proud of what we've done. I feel like we've accomplished some things. We're always learning. So yeah, it's been a really fun and interesting topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't believe you went to Kenya. That's amazing. I mean, what a learning experience just traveling abroad anyway, right?
As I say, it was an incredible experience because, I had to navigate so many different things, but as a biologist, of course, it was a fantastic place to be. But again, it taught me so much about being a biologist and being a conservation biologist and, things that I know have been useful in my career as I've gone on.
So have you ever been to Cumberland Island?
I have indeed. It's fantastic. I've been several times. I can't say that I know it well, but I've spent a lot of time over the years on St. Catherine's Island. In fact, I was the ring-tailed lemur nutrition advisor because of my background as a primatologist.
Very cool.
So you probably know that there are ring-tailed lemurs that, of course, were introduced, but they're free-ranging on St. Catherine's Island. So I know St. Catherine's Island very well. And more recently, I've been spending a lot of time on another barrier island in South Carolina called Deweese Island, which is just north of Charleston.
Okay. All right.
So just north of Charleston. But again, it's a very similar, of course, ecosystem,
Right.
to all of these barrier islands that we have in the Southeast. So I've spent time on Cumberland. I know it. I love it. I just don't know it, as well as I know some of the other islands.
Have you ever seen a coyote on Cumberland?
I don't believe I have. I can't say that for sure, but yeah, I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. I see coyotes all the time
Oh,
now,
yeah.
so nothing really stands out about seeing them there. But I'm certainly aware of the fact, that they are there. We've been kind of keeping an eye on things, for the last 10 years. As I said, all the time while I was at St. Catherine's Island, we were keeping an eye on really all of the barrier islands with respect to coyote populations. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, if I'm not mistaken, the first reported sighting of a coyote on Cumberland Island was actually recorded by Carol Ruckteschell in 1989. Listeners, of course, know who Carol is. We've been talking about her a lot. So that was about 35 years ago. In 2008, there was a resident pair that was actually confirmed. But we shared in our June podcast episode that Jessica and part of her family were, for the first time, basically face to face with this species, a coyote, in what some would consider a surprising place on Cumberland Island.
I got to say, Chris was one of the very first calls I made when we returned home because of his expertise in this area and his extensive knowledge. So I'm really grateful that he was able to join us and shed some of his knowledge on our circumstances. Yeah.
Jess, I know you gave us a small teaser on our July newsletter podcast. Do you mind just kind of high level going over that? You don't even have to go into the details.
Sure. Yeah, because we want to make sure people actually go back and listen to the July podcast first and foremost. But I'm happy to recap it here a little bit, which is that our family, myself and 3 of my kids, were camping down at Sea Camp, which is obviously the most developed campsite on Cumberland Island.
Right.
And
definitely the most popular, right?
Well, it's got the amenities, right? It's got cold water showers. It's got restrooms. You don't have to treat your water. You're very close to the ferry. And we were in an area that is well lit, I should say, and highly trafficked. But as we were getting into our tent, and this is June, so it was late. It was a little after 9:00, I think. I got ready to join my kids in the tent and ask them to close their books and stop reading. And I heard a sound that was unfamiliar to me. And it caused me to pause. So being sea turtle nesting season, of course, had my red headlamp available and don't want to attract bugs in my tent. So I used my red headlamp to try and illuminate where I heard the sound, which was just on the other side of my small 4-person tent. And I use this as a learning opportunity with my kids. I joined them in the tent and I asked them to make their own observations about what they were seeing. So we observed at very close range the first coyote we have ever seen ourselves on Cumberland Island. I mentioned to Devin that over the years we have seen the scat, we have seen the tracks, we've certainly seen the evidence. And of course, we'll talk more too about sea turtles. And we know they're there and they're active on the seashore. But as a camper, I was not necessarily aware that I would encounter one at such a close range at such a sort of intermediate time of day. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But yes, that was our very first encounter with the species on the island directly.
Hey listeners, September is National Wilderness Month, and Wild Cumberland is celebrating all month long with the return of our Trivia Night fundraiser. Join us virtually from the comfort of your couch every Wednesday night in September to play Cumberland and nature-focused trivia. With over $500 in prizes, you'll have a chance at both weekly and Grand Series prizes. And don't worry, you don't need to be an expert on Cumberland Island to play. Make sure to stay connected with Wild Cumberland on our social media for more details.
Sightings are an increasing commonplace, right? So even in urban cities like, Metro Atlanta, like you were talking about, Chris. So generally, I think the public is starting to begin to understand, in large part because of the work that you, Chris, and your team have been doing, that coyotes are a permanent fixture in our lives, right? They play a vital role in our ecosystem. They're not going away. So people are also understanding that eliminating them does not work and will actually have negative impacts. We'll get to that a little later. So in general, we kind of have to coexist with these animals in our ecosystem, right? So what have you learned about just coexisting with coyotes in metro areas, as we continually expand in the city and drive them out of their homes, basically?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. Coyotes are now a part of our ecosystem, but I think the first thing that's important for people to understand is the reason that we have coyotes is because we as humans extirpated red wolves. And so the red wolf, which is a cousin of the coyote, they're the same genus, different species, existed here in the Southeast. And over the past 100 or so years, we as humans, unfortunately, systematically exterminated red wolves. And so the only place in the wild where they are left is, in fact, in a somewhat of an island setting. It's a place called Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. It's coastal North Carolina. It's a peninsula, really.
And these are where the red wolves are.
That is correct.
Okay,
that's where
gotcha.
red wolves are. And they
Sure.
were put there by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in an attempt to save the species. And so there are really only about 30 or 40 animals there, red wolves. And what that did, though, that meaning the loss of the red wolf at the hands of humans, has just sort of allowed this natural migration of coyotes into the Southeast. So coyotes are endemic to North America. So they're only found in North America. And the only thing that kept them out of the Southeast, they were west of the Mississippi River, were red wolves, their main competitors. And in fact, if we go back in through the fossil record, there are fossilized remains going back to the Pleistocene, 13,000 years ago, of coyotes in the East. So, these animals are part of our ecosystems in North America.
Yeah.
We have canids. We have, again, we have two species of wolf and then the coyote. They're all members of the same genus, which is Canis. And of course, dogs, the dogs that we all love and have.
The one that's sitting on my couch right now, right?
There you go. Member of the same genus, and they all came from the gray wolf. And the gray wolf is found in the West, also in the Northeast. Red wolves were in the Southeast. Coyotes were essentially coexisted with gray wolves, again, out West. But as we extirpated the red wolf in the Southeast, the coyote just naturally and gradually moved in. Canids, anybody that's got a dog and the dog gets loose, they can cover large distances in very short periods of time. So,
sure.
it's nothing preventing them from, expanding. And as I always tell people, we did
Yeah.
as humans, we did, and so they're just sort of following their natural tendencies. So I think that's the first thing I want people to understand. And the second thing is what Jess is describing is two comments about that is, number one, coyotes typically are wary of humans. They really don't want anything to do with us, but they are canid mammals. And just like your dog is on the couch over there,
Right.
that's what attracted us to these animals is companionship. They have personalities, canids. I'm talking about gray wolves, but, red wolves, dogs, coyotes, canid mammals. They have personalities like we do. And so some of your listeners might be familiar with the story of Carmine, and I won't go into all of that, but Carmine was a black coyote who appeared in metro Atlanta back in 2020 in the Smyrna Vinings area. This story went viral. We ended up intervening, which we normally wouldn't do, but we ended up capturing Carmine and taking him to a place called Yellow River Wildlife Sanctuary, which is in Lilburn, which is a fabulous place.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right down the road from where I am. And
Okay.
now that I think about it, is he still there?
Yes, he is.
Oh
Yes,
my
he is.
gosh. That's the
Yeah.
coyote I've been seeing then.
That's it. And so the only reason we intervened is because Carmine was being overly friendly, not aggressive, friendly. Carmine was trying to get in people's backyards and play with their dogs. He tried to go through doggy doors. He was following people who are out walking their dogs on a leash.
Oh, wow.
So, and we published a paper about this. We work with a colleague at Princeton University, Dr. Bridget von Holt, who's a well-known canid geneticist. So that's a whole nother story. But the point is that, these animals have different kinds of personalities, if you will. They will behave in different ways. And some of them are going to be curious. Some of them are going to be very reticent. Some of them might be aggressive, but usually not aggressive. You just never know. But seeing a coyote or it being interested in you is not necessarily unusual. It's a wild animal. You should treat it as such, just like any wild animal. But it's not something to be overly concerned about.
So you mentioned the kind of migration from the coyotes from, west to east and how they have kind of taken over the southeast in the absence of the red wolf and everything. What is the difference between like a western coyote and an eastern coyote? There's got to be some sort of size difference, right? Because of the different terrain.
Well, there could be, but it's very difficult to say for sure because a typical coyote here in the southeast is about 30 pounds. Might be slightly smaller in the west, but it's the same species.
Okay. So we're basically dealing with the same coyotes there.
We're dealing with the same coyotes. There's some thoughts that, well, maybe the coyotes in the east are slightly larger because they have a larger prey base. But, I don't know that that's been necessarily proven. Yeah, western coyotes tend to be a little bit smaller, but it can also be very deceiving because just like your dog, if you have a dog that sheds its coat throughout the year, coyotes do the same thing. It's very dramatic in wild canids. You see a coyote in the wintertime, it'll look big. And you see that same animal, it will look like half the size of the way it looked in the wintertime. And it's very striking if you go see Carmine, and Carmine actually lives with another coyote named Wiley. That was why we took Carmine to Yellow River, is because they already had a coyote in captivity that they couldn't release. Right. Carmine was not going to fare well, and so we put them together, but they're both have been there's no reproduction going on there. So, but they get along well, really well. But anyway, if you go see those animals, in the wintertime, they're big and fluffy, and people tell me they must be 90 pounds, and then they see them in the summertime and they're just little skinny things. And, really they weigh about 30 to 35 pounds.
That's incredible. You never would know seeing all that fur on them and everything. So
that's right. And that fur does not weigh dozens of pounds.
Right.
So, yeah, it's very deceiving. So.
Sure. So do you know if coyotes are found on all of the barrier islands in Georgia?
I don't know for sure, but I would suspect so. I've seen coyotes swim in Yellowstone long distances, deep water, fast water. So the point being is that they're very good swimmers. In fact, Carmine got loose and swam across Yellow River twice. So these animals, they have no fear of the water. They're very good swimmers. We've seen incredible footage that people have taken of coyotes swimming at Deweese Island. And so
wow.
Clearly, these animals are swimming to these islands.
Yeah.
Maybe it's, who knows exactly. That's something that we're trying to figure out is how much gene flow there is. But, clearly it's happening. And that to me is so fascinating to think that these animals can stand on the mainland and look out. I guess I'd love to know what's going through their minds,
Right.
and to make this decision to take a swim that I wouldn't want to make,
Right.
you know? So even if it was low tide or whatever. So they are likely on all of these islands, not in large numbers, but they're extremely adaptable because their diets are very broad. They do well around people. Again, they're good swimmers. They don't need lots of space. They can, they'll live in
Well,
lots of space.
that
Yeah.
sort of leads into one of my questions, Chris, which is like, how big is a typical pack size, or how big is a coyote's typical territory? And are you observing differences on barrier islands as compared to the mainland?
Yeah. So two questions there. So as far as pack size, let's just talk a little bit about coyote social structure. Like all
Please.
canids, they're extremely social animals, and so they are striving to live in family groups. In fact, I often tell people that coyotes are a lot like us. They strive to have a stable nuclear family group. And so what I mean by that is what we call an alpha male and female. These are coyotes I'm
Hmm.
talking about, but the same applies to wolves. So you got a male and female as the breeding pair, and they will mate for life. They will stay together. They
Wow.
will have pups, maybe every year, maybe not. They're very devoted parents. Both mom and dad help to rear the offspring. The older siblings will typically disperse and go off and try to form their own families. But some of them will stick around and help raise younger brothers and sisters. And that's very common in the natural world, not just in canids, but in lots of species. That's called kin selection. You're helping to perpetuate your own genes by, helping to raise your brothers and sisters because you
Sure.
share genes with them, so they're trying to have this stable family group. Now, if they don't have that, or when they get kicked out of the family, have to go off to college or, wherever they go, they disperse. We call that dispersal. And that happens, if it usually happens probably at 6 to 8 months of age.
Okay.
So they go off and they become what we call transients. And so the typical coyote is striving to be a resident. In other words, a mated pair with their family. But when they're not a resident, they are transients. And so the territory size, Jess, that gets to your second question, is very much related to what is your social status? Are you a resident or are you a transient? If you're a resident, you have a stable home range. What's that size of that home range? Well, some of us live in apartments and townhouses on, 0.25 acre lots. And some of us live on farms, that are 50 acres. And the same thing with coyotes. They are, again, this is what makes them so successful, is they can live in very small spaces. They can live in very large spaces, just like we do. It just depends on, are their needs being met? How dense is, the overall population size? But they've got to maintain that territory. And that's where howling and barking and scent marking and leaving scat comes into play, is they're marking their territory, letting, rivals know this is where I live. It really just depends on the animal. So again, I think that's one of the things that makes them so fascinating is, they're very adaptable. So these animals that get to these islands, these coyotes that get to the islands, that's something that we're trying to figure out. That the coyotes that we're studying on Deweese, we think it's just one pair, one mated pair, but we know the makeup of the alpha male and female has changed. And the reason we know that is because the male was black, just like Carmine, which is a very unique phenotype. He got there. He was there for 2 years. They had pups. 2 of the pups were black. It's a dominant trait. So you only need to have one copy of the gene. And then he disappeared. And so did the black pups. But guess what? Reproduction happened again eventually. So that means either a new male arrived or, that's something that we're trying to figure out and we're doing that now through some DNA extraction of scat analysis. So I'm saying all of this. I know this is about Cumberland Island, and I don't mean to keep referring to Deweese Island, but I bring that up just simply because it's very similar.
Yeah, absolutely.
Same situation. Now, Cumberland Island is larger. I don't know. I'm not on the ground at Cumberland. How many different social groups are on Cumberland or how many it can support. I don't know. It's hard to say. I would suspect probably more than one, but that's going to bring us to our next topic, which I'll stop it, but I'll let Jess or you bring it up perhaps. And that is about
Sure. Yeah.
controlling coyote populations.
Yeah.
But I also want to ask, there was some preliminary research done or mentioned, I guess, not even necessarily asked, but back in 2015, there was some study done on both bobcat and coyote scat on Cumberland. And I mean, that's where I sort of began this journey learning about coyotes on Cumberland. And, there's no shortage of food on Cumberland, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Whether it's rodents, whether it's nuts, fruits, berries. I mean, they love persimmons.
I love them. Go watch some of our videos on our website about persimmons. It's incredible. They seek them out and they love them.
But I'd be interested to see, I guess, if their diets have changed over the last decade. It's been almost a decade since that research was done, especially as the populations continue to grow. And we know there's been a change in the population in part because some of the data I think we'll talk about maybe or touch on later. But admittedly, some of my questions about how the seashore manages its coyote population are best directed at the seashore and at the Park Service. But I was looking at the seaturtle.org data for Cumberland Island. I'm not sure how to interpret what I see there. I know most laypersons probably aren't, frankly. But there are at times, numbers that indicate either both significant nest loss or egg losses that sort of ebbs and flows over the years, right? So I think it goes back somewhere like 2009, 10 coyotes were then not listed as a method of depredation or a means of depredation for our sea turtles. But then there were several years that those were a primary cause of depredation of our nesting animals. So it seems to sort of ebb and flow, and it may have something to do, to your point, about how the populations are managed in different and various places. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how, when you manage a coyote population, that impacts the ecosystem that's involved.
Right. And it gets back again to an understanding of the coyote's biology and behavior and that social system that I talked about. So it's only the mom and dad who are the breeders, and they will have.
So it's like the parents almost keep everybody in check, right?
Exactly. And so there's not, breeding by subordinates. If they want to breed, they've got to go off, and find their own mate and territory. And that's generally going to be somewhere far away. Now, of course, on an island, that means leaving the island, so I understand that that's part of the situation. But what happens is, if that stable family group is disrupted, again, let's say one of the parents with the alpha breeders is killed somehow, or, is lost, that eliminates, or that removes that control on subordinates from breeding. And so now you have this situation where, remember that there are transients out there. And again, I understand, we may be, talking on an island situation. And this is one of the things that fascinates us so much about it, is how easy is it for these animals to move on and off the island. But clearly it's happening. And so if you disrupt that family group, all bets are off now. So now you've got these subordinate animals that are maybe hanging around, and now they may be mating with, individuals that are now coming in looking for an opportunity. These transients are out there. Maybe they have found an unmated female now. Maybe they have found these so-called subadult, coyotes from the previous year. And what starts happening now is you've got more individuals breeding. They're having larger litter sizes, and this is something that we talk a lot about, is that lethal management may knock the population back temporarily, but it's very difficult to do this long term. And what's happening is that the coyotes are just responding by continually having more and more offspring, larger litter sizes. And so, what starts off as an attempt to try and control the population ends up with unintended ecological consequences. It backfires. And so it ends up producing more coyotes in the long term rather than fewer. And that's hard for people to understand. It seems counterintuitive. This is just sort of the way the natural world works. If you reduce the number of individuals that are on the landscape, yeah, you're going to reduce the population, but now the resources are there for fewer individuals. And those fewer individuals are going to exploit those now more plentiful resources, and they're going to start building the population back up again. And so now you knock it back down. And so you kind of get into this cycle of population reduction, population expansion. And we advocate for this as biologists because we've seen it over and over again, the so-called unintended consequences of
Yeah.
lethal management on predators. Predators don't need to be controlled by us. They control their own populations. They will only have enough offspring, those offspring that will survive. In fact, many of the coyote pups that are born in a year won't necessarily make it to adulthood.
Wild Cumberland is staffed entirely by volunteers. We say that a lot, often in passing, but we want to make sure our listeners understand what that really means. Our team members donate their time, effort, and talents to help ensure that Cumberland Island and its wilderness remain protected. Every volunteer can find a place with us. We invite you to sign up to staff Wild Cumberland events, contribute to the organization's social media, assist in grant writing, and much more. Join us at wildcumberland.org and help make a difference for the next generation.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Jess, but the NPS has authorized kind of like a lethal management plan of these coyotes on the island. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's in part because there are so many endangered species, including the sea turtle, but also shorebirds, that necessitated the agency enacting a policy, I think in 2019, that authorized that sort of lethal control. I don't know that we have a lot of information about what that looks like on the ground at Cumberland and how many, for instance, might be culled in any given year. That is something that I think I and the public should be maybe better understanding. I think that management plan, if I recall correctly, when I looked at it a long time ago, I think it allocated for like the culling of up to 12 coyotes per park unit each year.
Oh, wow.
Which it's a really significant number. I mean, any number, to Chris's point, any number is a significant number within the coyote sort of social structure. So I guess I have to assume that the Park Service understands maybe everything you do, Dr. Mowry, about how coyotes reproduce.
I'm not on the ground there, so I don't want to get too much into this, but you might want to go back and look at something that the Georgia DNR instituted back in 2019 called the Georgia Coyote Challenge, that we spoke out very strongly about. And
yeah, there's a small blurb about that on your website, correct?
Yeah, and that has been discontinued, but what that was really a coyote killing contest.
They still sort of do this. It's just called a different name now. It's like the coyote cull instead of,
well, you
right?
have to be careful. No, as far as I know, and again, I'm not here to, question management practices. I'm just, speaking about what I know as someone who studies coyotes, is that,
Sure.
From our research and from the research of many of our colleagues, we don't believe that lethal management is the right way to go about it. We think that it, again, has the opposite effect eventually and produces these, unintended consequences. And I would also like to point out, Jess, you mentioned about that data on seaturtle.org, and I've also looked at it. Again, I'm just looking at it as a member of the public as well. But, coyotes have very broad diets, as I've alluded to, and Jess, you alluded to. And so they perform a function in the ecosystem as predators. What do they eat? They eat raccoons. They eat ghost crabs. They eat snakes. They eat fruit. So their diet is not just animals, but they are part of the circle of life. And when we start removing things from that sort of, as we call it, a trophic cascade, sometimes things don't go according to plan. I mean, the classic example of this is the loss of the gray wolf in Yellowstone and the eventual reintroduction of the gray wolf into Yellowstone in the mid-1990s, which was arguably one of the most successful reintroductions. And if you're not familiar with that story, it's just simply that the greater Yellowstone ecosystem essentially crashed because gray wolves, the top predator, were removed from that ecosystem for 70 years. And so what happened? Ungulate populations increased and they overgrazed the trees, and it influenced the temperature of the rivers, and the coyote population expanded. So everything got out of whack. And putting those wolves back into Yellowstone in the mid 1990s has restored that ecosystem. It's not without controversy, I understand. And some people will argue, against it. And I'm not saying that the coyote is the exact situation, but we don't have wolves, was the red wolf for us here.
Right.
We had them. We don't have them anymore. Our ecosystem evolved over millions and millions of years with top predators. And the coyote, in some ways, is now serving that role. Bobcats are also there, bears in some instances, but that's what we have, and they do perform a function, whether we like it or not.
You were talking a little bit about their diets there, and it made me think about some of the changes that maybe the Park Service has even been sort of maybe proactively and passively managing for this species. I mean, a couple years back, we had bear boxes installed across the island. And I never could understand that because they're so loud and they clang so loudly, and it doesn't do much to protect the natural sounds and quiet of the park. But it would make sense given what you're saying about the omnivore sort of diet, where if visitors aren't really adhering strictly to a leave no trace, sort of practice, and are leaving even fruit, vegetables, other items that coyotes would find enticing around areas where they're camping, that could have been potentially a passive and proactive management strategy. I mean, I think that they even removed the compost bin that had been there for a number of years. So even though they maybe haven't been transparent about, and maybe I'm drawing conclusions, I don't want to do that on behalf of the agency, but I am reflecting and looking at some of the changes that have happened and wonder if that was a part of maybe some of the visitor experience changes we've all witnessed over the last few years, and that maybe they just haven't been as candid. Maybe they're afraid of the perception of coyotes in camping areas. Maybe they knew how much work it would take to really educate and interpret, and provide proper interpretation for visitors who are aware of the species. But it's kind of interesting to think about. And so on that note, let me ask, for campers on Cumberland Island who, maybe were previously worried about possums or raccoons, this may present some questions both about their safety, right, and how to be better prepared to protect these animals. Because we've all, I think, or many of us have heard the expression, fed wildlife is dead wildlife, right? So are there steps that campers or visitors to Cumberland Island might want to take, knowing that this population is perhaps more active or increasing in a way that they may encounter during a standard visitor experience? Is it something as simple as cleaning off your grill at night, where previously that wasn't an issue?
Before you answer that, Chris, is it abnormal for, let's say, an experience like Jess's, for, a coyote to be, what would you say, 3-4 foot away from you, Jess?
Yeah.
Is this a normal type behavior?
That's not. And the questions that you both are raising, or the points that you both are raising, are, it's the same discussion that we have anywhere, with people, whether it's suburban Atlanta, downtown Atlanta, or Cumberland Island. It's the same kinds of advice and the same kinds of things. So yeah, Devin, in response to your question, no, that's not typical behavior. And so what it suggests to me is that's learned behavior,
Yeah.
And I don't know that for sure. That's my guess. It's not malicious, or it's maybe not intentional on someone's part, but
Right.
these animals, like any animal, like a possum, like, anything, they're looking to feed themselves, like we all are. And
Right.
so, any opportunity to make that job easier, they're going to take advantage of, and so if that means getting into the compost pile or getting into trash or whatever, yeah, they'll do it. And then, as I mentioned at the outset, coyotes are social animals. They're smart. They have different personalities. And so, this is a behavior that can be learned. It can be reinforced. It can be taught.
Just like Carmine, right?
Exactly. And, for whatever reason, a coyote or coyotes have come to associate, humans with food. That behavior is going to be hard to break. And again, it can be, now if you're your parents who are trying to raise your kids, your pups, and you've all of a sudden found an easier way to do it by bringing them around this place where there are humans, your normal reticence and shyness and wariness around humans might be overcome by, the temptation of this food resource. That's a possibility. So,
Sure.
the advice is the same advice again we give. There are wild animals out there. You need to be careful with your food scraps, your food, your waste, everything that you bring in, just like you would go camping anywhere.
So those tips, as far as, say they encounter a coyote, is the same as any other wildlife. Just keep your distance, slowly back away. They're more scared of us than we are of them.
Yeah, I know, but I'm always, hesitant to say that because again, you don't know what that particular situation is. If you've now
Sure.
encountered a coyote that's been habituated, I would see the same kinds of things in Africa at times, with different
Yeah.
species. And so if you're dealing with a species that has been, as we say, habituated or accustomed to being around humans and it's not quite as wary as it once was, you standing there yelling at it, clapping your hands, or as we call hazing, may not have any effect.
Sure.
And so, yeah, hazing is something that we oftentimes, advocate. And again, by hazing, we mean, just making noise, just trying to instill that natural fear that coyotes have towards humans, try to maintain that. Now, when I say that natural fear, though, Carmine, getting back to the story of Carmine was less than a year old. We have no indication that he was captive raised. He was a wild animal. He was overly friendly. And in fact, what's been really interesting, and so we looked for this gene. We did not find it in Carmine, but I referenced our colleague, Bridget Von Holt, and she's done some amazing work finding the gene for friendliness, if you will, in wolves.
Wow.
And so this is likely what we were selecting for as humans as we were domesticating dogs.
Absolutely, yeah.
We didn't know it, at the time. We were just simply, hey, this one came a little closer to the campfire.
Right, yeah.
And so that natural range of behavior can occur within a population. And so, you don't know. It's hard to say for sure. Are we talking about an animal that has a natural propensity, that has less fear of humans, or has it been conditioned to have less fear of humans?
Sure. Yeah.
Hard to know for sure.
Are coyotes aware of red lights? It didn't seem to faze my little friend at all. Like he just looked right back in our face. And I wondered if it would be different with a typical light.
Well, I mean, in answer to the first question, red lights, yes, they do. And I know that for a fact because we commonly use remote cameras. We use them all the time. We have them all over the place. The kinds of cameras we use are low glow, and what that means is that a red light is being used to illuminate the subject, but it's not a bright white light, so you're not scaring the animal. But all of the coyotes that we get clearly, look at the camera. They see that red light and they look at it. Usually they're not fazed by it. They see it. They're probably curious about it, but they're not fazed by it. Would a white light be more effective? Probably. It's just brighter and it's more of a surprise to them. It's hard to know how accustomed they are to seeing something like that.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, Cumberland Island has a lot of boaters and, yachters who come over and walk their pets on Cumberland Island. And this whole second wave of visitors after the last ferry leaves, and again early in the morning. So that, of course, falls right in line with coyotes, right, in their active period.
Yeah.
So they're usually pretty small dogs. It's not like you'll see a Labrador running on Cumberland Island or anything like that, right?
Sometimes, but they are typically pretty small. Yeah, if they're boat dogs.
Yeah. So what's that experience like with coyotes and other small animals? I mean, I wouldn't want my dog around that.
Nor would I. But, again, you have to remember that this is not a natural prey item for a coyote. They did not evolve to, eat these animals.
Sure.
Nevertheless, you're a predator and you're triggered by the movement of prey and you're hungry and you see something running. Might it get it? Sure, it's possible. My advice is always don't let your pets run freely, particularly in a place like Cumberland. But, there are lots of things that, could impact a dog. There are raptors, there are snakes. There are coyotes, there are bobcats. So, yeah, could a coyote take a dog? It could. Can a coyote play with a dog? Yep. So,
Go either way there, right?
it can go either way. We've seen both.
It is interesting to think about how a pet owner could potentially happen upon a den or pups, as far as coyotes go, and really disrupt that structure. So
That's I didn't point out earlier that coyotes are very seasonal breeders. And so breeding occurs in the wintertime. The pups are born, generally mid-March, and then the pups emerge from the den a few weeks later. So it's always, in the spring. I mean, that's the only time the den is used. So it's really only for about 6 weeks, and then they're done with it. They may come back and reuse it the next year, but they're not using the den otherwise. But if you get close to the den during pup rearing, they're going to be very protective. Now, oftentimes coyotes, again, really interesting. They want to avoid conflict. And we hear these, reports all the time, is coyotes will do a behavior known as escorting. One of the parents will come out and go in the opposite direction, away from the den, to literally try to draw attention away from the den and to escort, if it's a dog, nearby, away from where the den site is. Now, if it feels threatened, or if the dog continually has been coming around or whatever, certainly problems could occur, but it's not necessarily a given that that's what's going to happen. It's going to end poorly for the dog.
So just a kind of like a brief description of their den, just in case, somebody happens to walk upon it. What does that look like?
Yeah, it depends. Oftentimes it's an excavated hole in the ground. And by the way, I should point out, at all of these things that I'm talking about, people can go to our website, atlantacoyoteproject.org, and find out all kinds of good information and see video and things like that.
It's such a great website. Like, it is so full of resources. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, well, thank you. My son did the website, and so shout out to him, Alex Mowry. He did a great job of
Fantastic job, Alex.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, so for example, there's a den site that we watched for several years. It was 11 feet in depth. We actually used a gopher tortoise camera, stuck it down in there, of course, when the coyotes weren't there. And it was 11 feet deep, excavated into the ground.
Oh my gosh.
Another one we've been watching recently, though, is just a downed tree that was old and hollowed out in the middle, and they used it as a den. There's some video we have about that, which has just been incredible to watch. So it's usually something that's hard to find. If a coyote feels threatened, they'll move the den. So they really don't want these dens to be found. So they'll put them in places where generally people won't find them.
I want to touch on the sea turtles and everything real quick before we wrap up.
Yeah.
Do you have any observations or anything kind of related to coyotes and sea turtles specifically?
Yeah. So again, having worked at St. Catharines and now at Deweese Island, I sent students to Jekyll Island as well. And, working with the Sea Turtle Center at Jekyll Island, Terry Norton is a friend of mine who started the Sea Turtle Center at Jekyll Island. So, we certainly are aware of coyotes and sea turtles and might, the concern of coyotes, depredating sea turtle nests. And, does it happen? Certainly. Of course it does. Will a coyote, eat a sea turtle egg or a hatchling if it finds it? Yeah. But there are lots of things that will do that. Raccoons, as I mentioned before, raccoons and ghost crabs and hogs. These are all, and armadillos, these are all animals that are, documented as depredating sea turtle nests. And so, that's why we take conservation efforts to try to protect sea turtle nests by covering them, by relocating them if necessary. So, will coyotes depredate sea turtle nests, and do they? Yes, of course they do. But, let's again remember that they are also preying upon some of the other things that will depredate sea turtle nests, as I said, raccoons and ghost crabs and armadillos and raccoons. So it's the circle of life. And so the other thing I want to say, Devin, is sea turtles, of course, are reptiles. The number of eggs per clutch is about 100. The number of eggs that were laid on Cumberland Island in a year can be somewhere between 40 and 70,000. The number of those individuals that will make it to adulthood is a very small number. So do we want to protect sea turtles? Of course we do. Loggerhead sea turtles are threatened, and leatherbacks and hawksbills and Kemp's Ridley are endangered. And so, yeah, these are species of concern. But it's more than just coyotes, that are potential predators on these nests. And if anything, we should be more concerned about climate change and, shifting currents and, rising tides and things like that are inundating sea turtle nests. So, it's a whole suite of things that we need to be concerned about, or that people should be concerned about. If you're concerned about the conservation of sea turtles, again, we can't look at them in isolation. We have to look at the big picture.
What amazing creatures, honestly, with coyotes.
They are. Sea turtles are amazing creatures. That's what's so much fun about being a biologist, is that there are lots of amazing creatures out there.
Sure.
And so, I think doing this, as a coyote researcher, has just given me such an appreciation, and a respect for these animals. I know they're controversial, and I know, some people have, negative opinion of them. Other people don't, but some people do. But they are part of our ecosystem, and I think they're fascinating animals.
Sure. And I definitely want to reiterate our goal in sharing this information and, having this podcast and everything is not to alarm anyone. Jess had that experience. So we wanted to talk to an expert in that field just to kind of see the best way to navigate those situations and if there are any threats or anything like that. So we're just here to help facilitate a better understanding and appreciation for all of our ecosystems and species, including coyotes, right? So we'll be putting up some information about coyotes and Cumberland Island on our website following this podcast, but we urge you all to learn more about and support the Atlanta Coyote Project at atlantacoyoteproject.org. Like we've been saying this entire episode, they have some amazing information on there. Thank you, Chris, for making the time to join us today. I know it's gotten a little bit later than we wanted it to, but your expertise in this is invaluable to us, and it's really important to the overall discussion of Cumberland Island and its ecosystem. So we look forward to hearing more about your work related to coyotes and our barrier islands.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me and giving me this opportunity to speak with you. And I just want to say, what great work you all do, and, what a wonderful resource, Cumberland Island is. And so I love it as much as anyone, and want to see it conserved. So thanks for all you do as well.
You're the best. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise. And thanks to all of you for listening in and trying to learn a little bit more about this species that now inhabits the island, right?
Absolutely.
As always, we know how valuable your time is, so thanks for choosing to spend some of it with us.
Yep. Stay wild. Wild Cumberland is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and all donations are tax deductible. Learn more and take action at wildcumberland.org.
The Wild Cumberland Podcast is produced by Vertical River, and this episode was edited by Greg Cuson.
The reason I roam, they drove me from my home. They killed the wolf